Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of FineTuned. Before we get started, I just wanted to say if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave those in the comment section or in any of the forms or my website that I have linked below. I love it when people reach out to me. I love getting feedback, so please let me know what you think, what your thoughts are, and if any of these videos are helping you. In addition, I would also like to acknowledge that even though this video is about taiko drumming, our speaker, while an expert on taiko, is not Japanese, and I'd like to point out the importance, as he does later on in the video, of learning about things, especially of other cultures, from people who are native to that culture, so we can accurately and respectfully represent it. And I hope that you guys take that message from this video. Thank you so much, and I hope you learned something. Hello, I'd love it if you could introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about your musical journey.
Okay, my name is Alasadair Denvil, and when I was a kid, I'm currently the director of River City Taiko, which is a community-based Japanese drumming group based in and around Richmond, Virginia, and I'm also the director or the instructor for the University of Richmond Taiko ensemble. As a kid, I had a background in music. I played a little bit of piano, played a little bit of viola for a little bit, guitar quite a bit, and also some chorus. But I'd never done percussion before. While I was on a trip in Japan as an undergraduate, I took a couple of lessons in taiko from for what was also sort of a community group. I think it was some high school teachers in Japan, in Kyoto, who were teaching taiko to foreigners, people like me who were visiting Japan. And then when I came back from overseas, I wound up in New York City. And at a certain point, I was looking for a hobby to invest in. And I found a teacher, Marco Lienhard, and he's the director of a group called Taiko-za, and he used to play with one of the performing groups out of Japan, Ondeko-za. So he played with them for 12 or 15 years or something. They toured around the world, did lots of gigs, and then he settled down in New York City and started teaching his own group. So I took lessons from him. I also wound up joining some other more community-based groups in New York City. There was Manhattan Taiko, there was Otatsu Taiko, and I played kind of with all of them, and started. I never, when I joined it, I really just liked it. I liked taiko, and I liked the exercise because it's very intensive physically. But I wasn't intending to perform, but I kind of wound up performing, and then I got reasonably good. Then I moved back down to Richmond, where I spent most of high school and college, and I wound up with the University of Richmond Ensemble and River City Taiko, which have both been around for just about 10 or 11 years. And so that's where we are today.
Yeah, awesome. It's really interesting to me. I've talked to a couple musicians, and I love how New York seems like an epicenter of just culture, and
yep.
They seem pretty ahead of where we are here in Midlothian or Richmond. But
yeah, and for taiko in particular, for taiko in the United States, a lot of the groups tend to be on the West Coast. So because there's a bigger Asian American community there, Japanese American community there. So a lot of the older groups tend to be from San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego area. But on the East Coast, there are more and more groups. But New York is definitely the sort of center for it, just like it's the center for so many things. But yeah, there are a lot of really good taiko teachers up in New York City.
Yeah, so what exactly is taiko?
So taiko, the word taiko means drum, but it also now sort of refers to this style of using these drums in performances. It's also sometimes called wadaiko. But taiko drums were used in Japan for hundreds of years. and the basic design of the drums was probably adopted from China and Korea. Japan adopted a lot of culture from China and Korea. But in Japan, it became very distinctively Japanese. The drums were used for, military purposes, because you can use them to communicate, or for, sort of psychological warfare, just make a lot of noise. They were used in religious ceremonies. They were used in sort of like courtly performances, like kabuki, or that kind of theater. And they were also used a lot in festivals. And the reason they're used in festivals is because they're very, very loud. And so before electrical amplification, if you wanted to have music that was going on that everybody could hear, just like if we go to a party, somebody sticks an MP3 player in, and it serves as, sort of the background music for the party or the event, that's what they would use taiko for. So there was a lot of festival use of taiko. And even if you go to Japan today, there are different little festivals in different parts of the country that happen at different times of year. And they all have their own specific melodies, specific style, specific meaning to what they're playing. And that festival experience of taiko, phenomenon of taiko, is actually what has propelled a lot of the taiko that gets written and performed today. So the appeal of it is, in a way, the simplicity. It's percussion. There is sometimes flute added, and there's sometimes chanting added, and there's the human voice that gets added, and some other things. But most of it is percussion. But it's really a marriage, not just of percussion, but also of dance, because there's a very big movement component to taiko, where even though we call them drummers, they're really drummers / dancers, because sometimes the movements are very specific. Partly that might be for, sort of ceremonial reasons. You might be playing sort of a festival piece, and in the festival you're supposed to move strictly in this way, or it might just be because it looks like a good dance. It's for the performers, it's just as much dance frequently as it is percussion, which makes it really good exercise. Makes it very difficult, but it's one of the really great features of taiko.
I find it really interesting, the original founding of just percussion in general. Even though the world is vastly different culturally, it all kind of rooted in something militaristic and communication based. Like, even if you look at timpani drums, a pretty Western type of drum, it was built to be on the back of a horse.
Right. Yeah. And that's so at the University of Richmond, I'm just one of several ensemble instructors. So there's also like a West African djembe group. There's a Brazilian group that does some sort of samba style percussion. There's an Indonesian gamelan group, and they all have drums too. And they're distinctive styles, but they're all basically the same thing. They're just a drum, and there's really kind of two drums that you can have, at least as far as I've encountered. There's one like this, where it's, you have the body, what they would call the do in Japanese, and then you have the hide, and it's sort of stretched between on either. You have two hides stretched on either side of the do. There's plenty of djembe drums that are the same basic construction. They're different dimensions. They tend to be longer and a little bit skinnier, maybe. And then the other type of construction is, and I don't have one on me here, but it would be where instead of being sort of tied and stretched with rope between the two sides of the drum, you would instead have the hide nailed into each side of the drum with tacks. In Japanese, those tacks are called byo, so those style of drums are called byo daiko. This one is, because it's tied, the word is shime daiko, tied as in like tying your shoelaces. So I agree that I get to see a lot of other percussion from a lot of other different places, and it's always wonderful to see how distinctive it is, but also to see how some of the basic framework, the basic architecture is the same. Now with Japanese drums, these ones tend to be the smaller drums, these shimidaiko or okedo style drums. They tend to be higher pitched, and so they sometimes serve a little bit more of like a metronome a timekeeping, making sure everybody has the basic backbeat. The bigger drums, which tend to be the byodaiko, where the hide is tacked onto either end of the drum, they can get very, very big. And I typically say they're barrel sized. And frequently, like in the United States, they're not just barrel sized, but they are actually made out of barrels. You can get a barrel from, say, a winery and repurpose it. You can prep it and then stitch hide to either end of it. Sorry, tack hide to either end of it. And actually, most of the drums River City Taiko has are made in exactly that style. And we can make them ourselves, which is another neat thing, is that we can actually make our own instruments in many cases, not these ones, but the byodaiko. And those drums tend to be bigger, and they're sort of more engaging to the eye. They also resonate more. They tend to be a little bit louder, lower pitched, lower sound waves, frequencies that carry a little bit more, just like what you would want for a festival.
Yeah, I've definitely seen taiko drumming at different festivals, and it does seem like there's a lot of the larger barrel-sized drums. And
yep.
Yeah, so I haven't been able to see a lot of the smaller drums, which is really interesting to me because I didn't know that they were a bigger part of it. So when you watch a taiko performance, what should you listen for, or how should you try and appreciate it?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, let me just a little bit more nomenclature. Those barrel-sized drums are typically medium-sized in that style. Those byodaiko they're typically medium-sized, and they're called chudaiko, which basically just means medium-sized drum. There are bigger ones, and they're called odaiko, great drum or big drum. Those byodaiko can be made smaller as well, and actually frequently you find them like in an ornamental, like maybe in a restaurant or something, as something of an ornament. But yeah, those chudaiko are kind of the mainstay of any taiko group. What you should be looking for is definitely looking at the chudaiko and how they are positioned, because there are a lot of different ways you can position the drums. You can sort of lay them flat on the ground, sort of like this, on a stand. You don't want them touching the dirt, but laid like this and just, sort of play right, left like that. Sometimes they're on their side, and you can sort of stand in front of them, square your shoulders off to them and play them like that. And sometimes they're naname, which means at an angle. And so there are lots of different styles for how you can place the drums that create a lot of different opportunities for how you hit the drum, how you move around the drum. There are some songs where you'll have like maybe 6 people sharing 3 drums, or 3 people sharing 1 drum, because of all of the movement, and the positioning of the drum makes it easy for people to move in, play the drum, move out, and have somebody else move in. Some of the bigger drums, you can have like 3 or maybe 4 people playing all at one time on just 1 drum. The hiradaiko, which are they're byodaiko shaped like this, except they're very, very round. They're much rounder, much bigger in diameter. So that would be the first thing to look at. Look at how the dancers move and how the position of the drum sort of influences or enhances that style of movement. And then listen to the mix of drums. We've talked a lot about, how there are different sizes of drums, and generally the smaller you get, the higher pitch you get, the bigger you get, the lower pitch you get, and see how those sounds mix together. And then with these drums, roughly the same rules apply, but they're going to tend to be even higher pitched than the byodaiko, even if they're very small, and see how those pitches sort of blend, how the rhythms are structured. Taiko has a nice blend where many of the songs do fit that sort of, familiar structure of 4 beats to a measure. The phrasing is not terribly odd. But there are also a lot of taiko songs that derive from like older festival rhythms or something like that, that have really odd, really strange time signatures, strange meters to them. And so it's neat to see how sometimes those mix together, and you'll get like a 4-beat measure and a 7-beat measure, and then a couple 4-beat measures and a 3-beat measure, which is just different from what we will generally be expecting to hear after listening to the radio, because everything is sort of kind of straight-laced like that. So that would be another thing to listen for and that I like very much. There are also a few smaller instruments, handheld instruments, like a small gong called a kane or a tarigane, that is yet another set of frequencies, very different from the drums. And that's also frequently used a little bit like a metronome, because the metallic kind of frequencies, the high pitches, are something that the whole group will be able to hear. And that sort of stitches everything together and makes sure everybody's on the same backbeat, on the same beat together.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting how forms of music that are more physically involved usually result in the group being more together because you're kind of appealing to all of the senses instead
Right, right.
of hearing. So you mentioned a little bit about dance. So how does the dance marry with the music to contribute to the overall piece?
Um, Say with festival pieces, sometimes it's just the movement has been lifted from the festival. And in particular, I would think of a song called Miyake, which is named for the island that it comes from, the island of Miyake. And the movement, actually, I've got two songs that I can think of, Miyake and Hachijo. Miyake, as an island, there's a lot of fishing going on. And so the movement is very, for this particular song, is reminiscent of fishers pulling in fishing nets or pulling fishing nets out. And it's supposed to sort of evoke that sort of momentum and that inertia of really pulling and then moving back and forth to grab again and pull. So sometimes it's sort of an idea that it's incorporated from a festival. There's another, sometimes that's where the movement is inspired from. There's another song like that from an island that's near Miyake called Hachijo. And that's an island where samurai would sometimes be sent to exile because it's very far south of Tokyo. And in that particular song, at one point, the movement is you take the form of an archer, because archery being one of the samurai arts. And so, the stories about samurai and longing is sort of is inspiring the style of movement that you get. There are also a lot of new songs where it's much more, the choreography is not so much inspired from, stories about the area it came from, but it is more purely dance. It is more playing with forms and playing with postures and playing with movements and just doing something that looks appealing. And that's whenever I stand back from the group and just watch what the group is doing rather than being part of it, I can sort of see the dance stuff going on. And I'm always struck by how appealing it is to just see like 3 or 4 or 5 people moving in tandem at the same time. It's really neat. I don't know what it is about like choreographed gymnastics or synchronized swimming or anything like that, but when you have a whole bunch of people moving together like that, I don't know, it's very energizing. It's very energizing.
And it's hard. Like it's
Yeah.
hard to get to that level of consistency. So it's definitely mesmerizing to watch, just like synchronized swimming, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
So are songs like passed down? Are they written for each group? Or is it kind of like you mentioned with gamelan? I know in West African drum
Yep.
music, each village has its own kind of musical sense. So could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, and that's actually a little bit of an intellectual property issue that Taiko has had issues with. I think it was about 20 years ago. There's a group in Japan, Oeru Sukuroku Daiko, sent out a letter to Taiko groups generally in North America saying, hey, you're playing a lot of our songs and you should be giving us credit, and maybe you should be giving us money, and maybe you should be learning the songs from us. Most of North America kind of ignored it, but it did highlight a real issue, which is that frequently these songs, you think that they're from Japan and it's traditional drumming, so it's 1,000 years old, it's public domain. Well, it might be, but frequently it's a song that's been written in the past, 60 or 40 or even 20 or 10 years, and like anything written. If I do a cover of a Bruce Springsteen song, he gets some share of the royalties. That's an issue. So what I've learned is that it pays to ask very carefully where songs come from and always transmit that to my students. So a lot of what I learned from my teacher, Marco Lienhard, who played with Onde Koza. So he learned a lot of it from Onde Koza, or specific people that Onde Koza collaborated with. So what I do is I'm always just very clear with everybody I'm teaching and any audience I'm playing for. I just try to give them a quick run through of here's how we wound up learning this song, and here's what it's about, and here's who it's from. Like with Hachijo, I would say, hey, this is based on festival rhythms from the island of Hachijo. It was taught to me by Marco Lienhard, who played with Onde Koza, and it's supposed to be reminiscent of an archer, a samurai who has been exiled and is trying to play something that his friends and family on the mainland will hear. Give a quick rundown like that. Or with a song that has been written recently, like say Oyuchi Daiko, that was written by Oeru Sukeroku Daiko, or Yodanuchi, which was also written by them. I'll say, hey, this song was written in the 1960s by this group in Japan, and I'll credit that group not just with the songs, but also saying this group was very pivotal in bringing taiko back to life in the 1960s, and played a big role in the modern renaissance of taiko. So, I mean, in a way, I like passing along that knowledge, but in a way, it's also really kind of stepping on toes if you don't. And actually, one of the things that I think Oeru Sukeroku Daiko was upset about was they saw North American groups performing the songs. They thought they were playing them very sloppy. So it's not just giving credit, it's also some quality control, considerations going on. And again, it is like there are some songs that I know and I can teach my group, but I learned them from Marco. I would rather have Marco come in, give us a workshop and teach it, because he's going to get a lot of little things more right and more refined than I will. So as often as possible, I try to bring in, people who are better than I am to teach my group, because it gives them a little bit of diversity, but it also gives them a higher level of expertise. And as often as possible, I try to explain to everybody within shouting distance, whether it's members of the groups, students, or audience, just give them an idea of where the songs came from and what they're about.
Yeah, I think that's a really important perspective to have too, because as the world is becoming more connected, and our society is becoming more inclusive and recognizing these amazing cultures, it's important to still, I think that's a really great thing that you're doing, that you're saying like, this is how we interpreted it, and it's important to like have other people always come in who are so much better than us to help us out. It's really important to like preserve that integrity. How has taiko helped you appreciate Japanese culture? And then just kind of building off of that, how do you think taiko can improve the understanding of that other Americans have of Japanese culture?
Well, that's good. I mean, I don't speak Japanese, so I have a big barrier to really fully engaging more fully with Japanese culture. But art is always a good way in. I mean, it's always better if you speak the language, but it's always a good way in, because you'll find a lot of commonality in sort of non-cognitive things like melodies, where two people who don't speak the same language will agree, oh yeah, that sounds really cool. Or they might even spot the same problem in a melody, or the same mistake that somebody makes. So it does provide an opportunity for a lot of common understanding, even when you don't have the linguistic commonality to work off of. People like certain rhythms. People like certain dances, even if it's very unfamiliar to them and from a different culture. And with taiko, particularly since in my group, River City Taiko, we have a lot of members who are first generation from Japan. They've offered a lot of things that they offered a lot of input from things that they learned while growing up in Japan, and they add them into the group. Like there are some songs that we sing sometimes before we play the drums that they knew about, that I would never be able to, I wouldn't know about, I wouldn't be able to teach them, but that gets added in, and so it makes the music more robust, and it also adds a lot of understanding to what the music, what the culture is about, what sorts of things the culture cares about. There's fishing. That's a really big part of Japanese culture, and it's sort of captured in that song Miyake. There are samurai who sometimes get in trouble and are lucky enough not to get executed. They just get sent into exile, and then they have feelings of longing, which everybody can identify with, and that's captured in the song Hachijo. It's captured in a lot of songs, Taiko and otherwise, from that island. And then there's and the dance component as well. Frequently things look cool. They look really neat, regardless of what your cultural background is. And so that's sort of and sometimes those movements in Taiko groups sort of mimic things that are idiosyncratic to Japan or sort of closely tied with Japanese culture, like Bushido code and samurai and archery and that sort of thing. And so that all offers, little avenues inward into Japanese culture that I've found really, really eye-opening, and that I think audiences get and students get a lot out of it too, because they can learn something like percussion, which is easy enough, but they can also learn a little bit about Japanese culture that comes with the percussion that they might not have been able to garner otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's a really great perspective. Art is like you said, it's such a great way to appreciate a culture. So what is something that you wish more people knew about Taiko?
It's really easy, actually. One of the things I really like about Taiko is the percussion side, the music side, and the dance movement side are both actually pretty easy. There are, of course, professional groups that do stuff that percussion-wise is really difficult. I certainly can't do it. And there are groups that do dance movement stuff that, again, it's really difficult. But a lot of songs are actually really, really very, very easy. It usually mixes sort of basic to moderate, basic to intermediate percussion with basic to intermediate dance. And when you have a big group, we can always, sort of fit people in where they're most needed. If there's, somebody who's, got a bad ankle and they can't do some of the dance stuff, we can slot somebody else in. Or if there's somebody who's particularly good at this fast percussive part, we can make sure that they wind up getting that. But again, a lot of the songs are really, they're not that difficult, and they're a great, and percussion in general is a really great skill to have, even if you've played something like piano or keyboard or flute. Percussion is a little bit different and minimalistic from that because you don't have the pitches and the chords and the chord changes to rely on. I like Taiko because it is this sort of 50% movement, 50% music. So there's a lot. So on the one hand, it's easy, but there's also, on the other hand, there's likely a challenge for you, unless you happen to be somebody who's really good at both music and dance at the same time. And even there, we could probably find something worth challenging you for. That's one of the things I really try to impress upon people a lot. Taiko is not that difficult. I know it can look spectacular, and it does take work, but with persistence, I've taught lots of people. So that's what I would like people to know about Taiko. It's actually, it's really fabulous, but it's not actually that difficult. It shouldn't be intimidating.
Yeah, so just to follow up, what is a Taiko orchestra like? How does it differ from what you've been talking about? Well, it probably doesn't differ, but not necessarily classical orchestra, but what kind of separates like a Taiko orchestra from like a community Taiko group?
Oh, like a professional groups. Yeah. They're in much better shape. So professional groups, I'll take Onde Koza as an example. They practice and drill an awful lot. And it wasn't just that they would play a lot of Taiko. It's that you would have to learn a lot of traditional stuff, like traditional dance, like sort of maybe kabuki style dance. And it was all an incredible amount of drill work. They also kind of practice almost as if they're doing a triathlon. So Onde Koza, what they did at least once when they came to the United States is when they were playing at Boston, they ran the Boston Marathon. And then when they got to the end of the marathon, they played a gig later that day, which is, yeah, I know. That's what they did. They don't, now that's a kind of a specific spectacle, but there is a lot of stuff like that. They are in super good shape. They drill a lot. And that sort of fits with the movement side of Taiko, where the people are really strong. They look like triathletes because they're dancers, and dancers are really, really strong. And they do a lot that's fairly acrobatic, or requires an awful lot of stamina. And that's what you get when you're playing Taiko for a living with a group of people like that. You can all push each other, and you have the time that you can commit to it. So it's a higher level of physical intensity. They typically have a much bigger range of drums. They'll get sponsored by one of the Japanese drum makers like Asano Daiko, so they'll get really, really nice drums and some really, really big ones. And they do tend to incorporate a lot more costuming and sometimes storytelling within their performances. Some groups like Drum Tao are almost a little bit like Taiko and Cirque du Soleil mixed together. And so there's a lot of theatrics in the costuming and sort of personalities.
It's amazing what people can do, and
Yeah.
I hope that like more people will learn about this, because I had no idea that Taiko was so physically intense. And I mean, I knew it took a lot, but I didn't know that that's kind of what professional Taiko groups require.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is my final question, and I like to ask this of all the performers that I've interviewed, because I love the answers that I've gotten. But as a performer, what does it feel like to perform Taiko?
It's weird because it doesn't feel quite like music. Like I play guitar and I play keyboard and I play with some other bands, and so I know what it's like to play music with them. But because of that physical component, it does feel different. It does feel more like dance, which again is very alien to me. I'm kind of in dance venues. I'm more of a wallflower. I'm not somebody who dances. But this is had me doing a lot of things in the realm of physicality that I wouldn't have occurred to me to do on my own. So it does feel a little bit not quite like sports, but there is that sort of, when you're with a group of people and you're playing a sport together, there's that sort of group effort, and there's something of the camaraderie in that. You do get something like that, although it does feel a little bit more like being part of a dance troupe with Taiko. It varies a lot from song to song, though. There are some songs that are physically very intensive. There are some other songs that are actually really pretty relaxing, much more based on the music. And so in those songs, you can get a little bit, more groovy and feel like you're playing with a music group. But yeah, the physically intensive songs, they feel like physical effort in a good way, a sports or dance kind of venue, kind of a environment. But there is also the joy of percussion and finding nice rhythms and sort of sometimes playing off of one another and playing in the pocket and all that. And so it's a nice mix of both of those things.
Yeah, I love how it's kind of how much that it can be more dance, it can be more music. It's really just what they want the audience to hear. And I find that kind of scale and the combination so interesting, because it's not like you must have XYZ. It's kind of, what does this feeling call for? So those are all of my questions that I have. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview with me. I'm really glad I got to speak with you. I'm really looking forward to sharing this with people and helping more people learn about Taiko. It is amazing.
And as COVID sort of goes away and the lockdowns, and we will be playing more gigs in the area, so please feel free to come see us.
Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned something and I hope you enjoyed yourself. Like I said at the beginning of the video, if you haven't already, check out the links that I have left in the description. I love hearing from you all. It always makes my day to know that people are interacting with the material. To stay updated on my capstone, check out my social media, also in the description, or my website. Follow, subscribe, like, all of those things. Thank you so much. Stay tuned.